For most of human history, green eyes simply didn't exist. Every human being on Earth had brown eyes, full stop. Then something changed. A tiny genetic accident occurred. It rewrote the human face forever. Today, science has finally traced that accident down to a single letter of DNA, and the story of how it spread is stranger than fiction. To understand where green eyes came from, you first have to understand what an eye color actually is at the biological level, because almost everyone gets this wrong. When you look at someone's green eyes, you are not looking at green pigment. There is no such thing as green pigment anywhere inside the human iris. Not a single molecule of it exists in nature within eye tissue. What you are actually seeing is an optical trick, a very specific interaction between light, tissue structure, and a pigment called melanin that is not green at all. Melanin comes in shades of brown and black. That's it. So how does a pigment that is only ever brown or black end up producing blue eyes, gray eyes, hazel eyes, and the rarest of them all, green eyes? The answer lies in how much of that pigment is present, where it sits inside the iris, and what happens to light after it enters the eye. Picture the iris as a thin, layered disc sitting just behind the cornea. Deep inside that disc is a layer that always contains dark pigment, no matter what color your eyes appear to be from the outside. This deep layer is essentially the same in every human being. It is dark, dense, and largely invisible to an outside observer because it sits behind another layer, the stroma, which is the layer that actually determines what color you see. The stroma is where the real variation happens. If the stroma is packed with a lot of melanin, the light entering the eye gets absorbed almost entirely by that pigment, and what bounces back to your eye reads as brown. If the stroma has very little melanin, something far more interesting happens. Light enters, but instead of being absorbed, it scatters off the tiny protein fibers inside the stroma. Shorter wavelengths of light, the blues, scatter more easily than longer wavelengths, so more blue light bounces back out toward your eye. That scattering effect is called Rayleigh scattering, and it's the exact same physical phenomenon that makes the daytime sky look blue. Your atmosphere scatters short blue wavelengths from sunlight in every direction, and your brain interprets that scattered light as a blue sky. A low melanin iris does almost the same thing on a microscopic scale. Blue eyes are not blue because of blue pigment. They are blue because of physics. So where does green fit into that picture? Green eyes sit in a strange, unstable middle ground. They occur when the stroma has a small to moderate amount of melanin, not the near total absence you see in blue eyes, but nowhere close to the dense concentration in brown eyes. That moderate melanin level adds a small amount of yellow-brown tint to the iris. When that subtle brown-yellow tint combines with the blue light being scattered out through Rayleigh scattering, the two effects blend together and produce the appearance of green. It's a mixing of pigment and physics happening simultaneously in the same thin layer of tissue, and the balance has to be almost exactly right. Push the melanin level up even slightly and the eyes shift toward hazel or light brown. Pull it down even slightly and the eyes drift toward a grayish blue. Green occupies an extremely narrow window on that spectrum, which is a huge part of why it's so uncommon. It isn't a distinct, separate category the way brown and blue often get treated. It's a precise balancing act, and biology rarely lands on precise balancing acts by accident, which brings us to the genetics of how that balance is actually controlled. For decades, scientists assumed eye color worked the way a lot of old biology textbooks describe it, as a simple trait controlled by one gene, with brown as the dominant version and blue as the recessive version. That model dates back to the early 1900s, when two researchers proposed it based on basic family pedigree observations. It was a reasonable first attempt, and it does roughly predict outcomes in a lot of families. But it is nowhere close to the full picture, and it completely fails to explain green eyes, hazel eyes, or the fact that two blue-eyed parents can occasionally have a child with darker eyes than either of them. The real explanation didn't arrive until researchers started digging directly into the genome instead of relying on old pedigree charts, and what they found was far more intricate than a single dominant recessive switch. The breakthrough moment came when researchers zeroed in on a region of chromosome 15, home to two genes working side by side, called OCA2 and HERC2. OCA2 had already been known for years to play a major role in how much melanin gets produced throughout the body, not just in the eyes, but in skin and hair as well. Mutations in OCA2 can cause a form of albinism when they're severe enough, which tells you how central this gene is to pigmentation generally. But researchers noticed something strange. The actual variation responsible for the blue-brown spectrum in most people wasn't sitting inside the OCA2 gene itself. It was sitting inside a neighboring gene called HERC2, in a stretch of DNA that doesn't even code for a protein. That stretch acts as a switch, a regulatory region that reaches over and controls how active the OCA2 gene is allowed to be. Inside that regulatory stretch of hierarchy 2, researchers found a single genetic variant, a single letter change in the DNA sequence, technically labeled rs1.913832, that turned out to have an outsized effect on eye color. The single letter can exist in two versions, and depending on which version you inherit, the OCA2 gene either gets switched on at a higher level, leading to more melanin production and darker eyes, or it gets dialed down, leading to less melanin and lighter eyes. One tiny change, sitting in a part of the genome that doesn't even build a protein, functioning purely as a volume dial, and that dial alone accounts for the majority of the difference between blue and brown eyes, across huge populations. This finding came out of genetic research published in the 2000s, and it fundamentally reshaped how scientists talk about eye color inheritance. It wasn't one gene turning fully on or fully off. It was a dimmer switch, an actual gradient, capable of landing anywhere between full melanin production and almost none. But that dimmer switch alone doesn't explain green eyes, because green requires more than just dialing melanin up or down. It requires additional fine-tuning from a handful of other genes layered on top of the HER2, OCA2 system. Researchers have identified genes like SLC24A4 and TYR that appear to nudge the final color in subtler ways, adjusting exactly how much pigment ends up in the stroma and interacting with how that pigment is distributed. TYR, in particular, is directly involved in the biochemical pathway that produces melanin in the first place, so variants within it can shift the fine details of pigmentation even after the main HERC2 dimmer switch has already set the broad range. One specific variant inside TYR, labeled SLP39350, has shown up repeatedly in studies as being associated with the difference between blue and green eyes specifically, suggesting it works alongside other nearby variants to push the outcome one way or the other within that narrow middle zone. All in all, researchers now estimate that at least 8 different genes contribute meaningfully to the final eye color you end up with, each nudging melanin production, distribution, or structure in a slightly different way. Eye color, it turns out, is not a light switch. It's closer to a mixing board with multiple sliders, and green eyes only appear when several of those sliders land in a very specific, very narrow combination. That complexity explains something else. Researchers have run into repeatedly, which is that predicting eye color from DNA alone is far easier for some colors than others. When scientists built genetic prediction tools using panels of known eye color variants, they found they could predict blue eyes with roughly 94% accuracy and brown eyes with roughly 93% accuracy, using just a handful of key markers. Green and hazel, on the other hand, dropped to somewhere around 72% accuracy. That gap tells you everything about how green eyes are built. Blue and brown sit at the extreme ends of the melanin spectrum, driven overwhelmingly by that one dominant dimmer switch in HERC2, so they're relatively easy to call correctly. Green sits in the crowded, unstable middle, shaped by the interaction of several smaller genetic contributions instead of one dominant one, and that makes it inherently harder to predict, even with modern genetic tools. It's a rare case where rarity in the population and difficulty in prediction come from the exact same underlying biological cause. Now here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because knowing the mechanism only answers half the question. The other half is where this mutation actually came from, and when. For the overwhelming majority of human history, this entire conversation wouldn't have made sense because every single human being alive had brown eyes. Deep, dark, heavily melanized irises were the default setting for our species, going back hundreds of thousands of years. Inherited from the same ancestral population that gave rise to every human alive today, there was no variation to speak of. Then, at some point, researchers estimate somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, a mutation appeared in a single individual, somewhere in the region, stretching from the Caucasus Mountains toward the Black Sea. That mutation altered the regulatory switch inside hierarchy 2, dialing down OCA2 activity for the first time in the history of our species, and producing the first blue eyes anyone had ever seen. What makes this discovery so striking is how narrow the origin point appears to be. When researchers compare the DNA surrounding this variant across different populations with light-colored eyes today, the surrounding genetic sequence is remarkably similar, almost identical in structure, which is a strong signal that everyone carrying this trait inherited it from the same original source, rather than it popping up independently in different places around the world. In genetics, that kind of shared surrounding sequence is called a haplotype. And a shared haplotype across a trait spread over thousands of miles and thousands of years points toward a single founding event. In plain terms, that means every person alive today with blue eyes, and by extension the genetic foundation underlying green eyes as well, is likely tracing that trait back to one ancestor, one individual, who carried the very first version of this mutation. Everything since then has been that single genetic accident, spreading outward, generation after generation, reshuffling and recombining with other genes along the way. Green eyes represent a further refinement of that original mutation. If blue eyes are the result of the melanin dimmer switch getting turned almost all the way down, green eyes are what happens when that switch lands in a more moderate position, or when the fine-tuning genes like TYR and SLC24A4 pull the outcome slightly back toward the brown end of the spectrum without fully reversing it. In evolutionary terms, green likely didn't need to evolve as a completely separate mutation. It emerged as a natural byproduct once the population carrying reduced melanin genes started mixing and recombining with populations that still carried higher melanin variants, creating new combinations that landed in that narrow middle zone. As early farming and herding communities in that Caucasus and Black Sea region began expanding outward across Europe and into parts of Asia, they carried these genetic variants with them, and through generations of intermarriage between light-eyed and dark-eyed populations, the full spectrum from blue through green through hazel gradually took shape. This raises an obvious question. If brown eyes had worked perfectly well for hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, why did this new mutation stick around at all? Random mutations happen constantly throughout any population's history, and the overwhelming majority of them vanish within a few generations, diluted out or simply lost by chance. For a trait to spread widely enough that it now shows up in a meaningful percentage of an entire continent's population, something usually has to be actively favoring it, rather than it just drifting along passively. Researchers studying the genetic signature around this mutation have found evidence consistent with what's called positive selection, meaning the variant appears to have been actively favored and spread faster than random chance alone would predict. That finding surprised a lot of scientists, because eye color on its own seems like an unlikely candidate for something evolution would actively push forward. Having lighter eyes doesn't obviously help you survive a harsh winter or fight off disease. Several competing explanations have been proposed to explain that unexpected selective pressure, and none of them have been fully settled yet. One idea centers on sexual selection, the theory that a new and visually striking trait, appearing for the first time in a population where everyone previously looked essentially the same, might have been perceived as attractive or novel, giving individuals who carried it a reproductive edge simply because they stood out. Another theory points toward the genes involved in eye color also playing supporting roles in other traits related to skin pigmentation, and lighter skin has a well-documented evolutionary advantage in northern latitudes, where weaker sunlight makes it harder for the body to produce enough vitamin D through skin synthesis. Under that theory, the eye color change might have been something of a genetic passenger, riding along with a more directly beneficial trait tied to the same stretch of DNA or influenced by nearby genes that were the real target of selection. A third line of thinking suggests the answer might be some combination of both, with visual novelty and pigmentation linked. Survival advantages reinforcing each other as populations pushed further north into regions with less intense sunlight. None of these explanations fully close the case, and it remains one of the more actively debated questions in modern human population genetics. Whatever the exact driving force turns out to be, the outcome today is clear enough in the numbers. Green eyes are found in only around 2% of the entire global population, making them the rarest naturally occurring eye color on Earth. Rarer than blue, rarer than gray, and vastly rarer than brown, which still accounts for the overwhelming majority of humanity, somewhere in the neighborhood of 79% worldwide. Blue eyes sit at roughly 8 to 10% globally, and distribution isn't even across the planet. Because the original mutation and its later refinements trace back to that Caucasus and Black Sea region before spreading through Europe, green eyes today show up disproportionately in people of European descent, and within Europe, certain areas, particularly around Northern and Central Europe, show noticeably higher concentrations than others. This isn't the result of any inherent biological difference between populations. It's simply the geography of where a mutation happened to originate, and how migration and intermarriage patterns carried it outward over thousands of years. In parts of the world outside the reach of that original migration, wave brown eyes remained essentially universal, not because of anything special about those populations, but because the specific genetic accident that created lighter eyes never spread there in the first place. Tracing that spread more closely, researchers studying ancient skeletal remains and the DNA recovered from them have been able to build a rough timeline of how this trait moved. Ancient genomes recovered from hunter-gatherer populations living in parts of Europe roughly 8,000 years ago already show the lighter eye variant present, paired in some cases with skin pigmentation genetics that still leaned darker, a combination that looks unusual by modern standards, but makes sense once you remember that different pigmentation genes were still shuffling independently at that point in history. As farming populations began moving into Europe from the Near East, carrying their own distinct set of pigmentation variants, the genetic mixing between these groups over the following millennia is what eventually produced the fuller range of hair, skin, and eye combinations seen across the continent today. Green eyes, sitting as they do in that narrow middle zone, likely became more common specifically during this long period of population mixing, as variants that had been evolving somewhat separately in different groups started combining within the same individuals for the first time. Beyond the raw genetics, researchers have also noted a cluster of traits that tend to travel alongside green eyes more often than you'd expect from pure chance, and the explanation for that comes right back to shared genetic machinery. The same genes and pathways controlling melanin in the iris also influence melanin production in skin and hair. So people with green eyes are statistically more likely to also have fair skin, lighter hair shades, ranging from blonde to red to light brown, and a higher tendency toward freckling. None of these traits cause each other directly. They're better understood as different visible outputs of an overlapping pigmentation system shaped by many of the same underlying genes acting across different parts of the body simultaneously, which is why families with a strong history of green eyes so often also share a similar look in skin tone and hair color across generations. There's also an interesting pattern with how eye color shifts over a person's life. Newborns with lighter eye tones often see their true eye color continue developing over the first year or so of life as melanin production in the iris gradually catches up. And later in life, some research suggests green eyes tend to shift less dramatically with age compared to blue eyes, which some studies suggest are more prone to appearing to lighten or shift subtly as melanin distribution changes over decades. Inheritance itself is worth pausing on too, because it explains why green eyes can seem to skip generations or show up unexpectedly in a family where nobody else has them. Because green eyes depend on a specific, narrow combination of variants across several genes, rather than one clean dominant or recessive pattern, the odds shift dramatically depending on which versions of those genes each parent happens to be carrying, even when neither parent's own eyes look green. Two brown-eyed parents can each carry a hidden copy of the lighter variants buried underneath their darker phenotype, and if both happen to pass those hidden copies to a child at the same time, that child can end up with green eyes despite having two brown-eyed parents standing right in front of them. Geneticists sometimes describe this using rough probability estimates rather than fixed rules, since so many variants are involved. When one parent has green eyes and the other has brown eyes, without any known family history of lighter eyes, the odds of a green-eyed child tend to run fairly low, often estimated somewhere in the range of a quarter or less, though the real number shifts depending on hidden variants neither parent can see just by looking in a mirror. When both parents carry green eyes, or when there's a stronger family history of lighter eye colors on both sides, those odds climb substantially higher. This is also why eye color prediction, even the seemingly simple version parents attempt informally by looking at grandparents and family photos, is notoriously unreliable. The visible trait only tells you part of the underlying genetic story, and the parts you can't see, the hidden variants sitting quietly in the background, are often the ones doing the real work. That unpredictability has become especially relevant in the era of consumer DNA testing, where companies analyzing raw genetic data from home testing kits now routinely include eye color predictions among their reports. These tools typically rely on a small panel of the strongest known variants centered heavily around that hierarchy 2 regulatory switch to estimate the likelihood of blue, brown, green, or hazel eyes. For blue and brown, these predictions tend to land close to reality, consistent with the high accuracy rates researchers have documented in formal studies. For green, the same tools become noticeably less reliable, often presenting a probability spread across several possible outcomes rather than a single confident answer, a direct reflection of just how many smaller genetic contributors are quietly influencing that narrow middle zone of the color spectrum. It's a useful reminder that even with an entire genome's worth of data sitting in front of them, scientists still can't fully untangle every thread involved in producing something as visually simple as an eye color. Long before any of this genetic detail was understood, green eyes had already accumulated an outsized cultural weight, precisely because they were so uncommon. In ancient Greek writing, unusually colored eyes were sometimes linked to hidden abilities or otherworldly perception, treated as a physical marker of something unusual happening beneath the surface. Centuries later, in Elizabethan England, green eyes took on a very different, more negative association. Immortalized by Shakespeare's phrase describing jealousy as a green-eyed monster, cementing green as a color tied to envy and suspicion in Western literature for generations afterward. In medieval Europe, unusual eye colors were occasionally caught up in superstition and folklore, sometimes viewed with suspicion during periods when anything visually distinctive could draw unwanted attention. That cultural baggage never had anything to do with the underlying biology, of course. It was rarity itself doing the work, the same way rare things across human history tend to get wrapped in myth long before anyone understands the mechanism behind them. It's a strange kind of irony that a trait now fully explained by a regulatory switch on chromosome 15 spent thousands of years being explained instead through gods, curses, and hidden powers. There's also a persistent thread of research looking at whether eye color correlates with anything beyond appearance, and the picture there is genuinely mixed rather than dramatic. Because lighter eyes generally come with lower melanin concentrations, and melanin isn't just responsible for color but also for absorbing and filtering incoming light, some studies have found that people with lighter eyes, including green eyes, may experience somewhat greater sensitivity to bright light and increased exposure to ultraviolet radiation reaching deeper structures of the eye. That same reduced pigmentation has been associated in some research with a modestly elevated risk for certain age-related eye conditions later in life, while other studies point in the opposite direction for different conditions entirely, showing potentially lower relative risk. None of this research is conclusive enough to draw firm medical takeaways from, and eye color should never be treated as a stand-in for actual clinical screening, but it does illustrate how deeply interconnected these systems are. The same melanin that gives your eyes their color is also doing real physiological work inside the eye, filtering light and offering a degree of protection, and small structural differences created by genetics can carry subtle downstream effects well beyond simple appearance. It's worth stepping back for a moment to appreciate just how much has to align for someone to end up with green eyes. It starts with a single mutation that occurred in one person, in one specific region of the world, likely somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years ago, altering a regulatory switch that controls the OCA2 gene. That mutation then had to survive the ordinary odds against any new genetic variant sticking around, likely helped along by some combination of sexual selection and pigmentation-linked survival advantages tied to life in northern latitudes. It then had to spread across an expanding population through countless generations of migration and intermarriage. And finally, within any individual person today, it has to interact with a handful of additional fine-tuning genes, TYR, SLC24A4, and others, landing in one precise, narrow combination that produces a moderate melanin level in the iris, just enough pigment to add a hint of warmth, but not so much that it overwhelms the blue light being scattered outward through the tissue. Miss that narrow window in either direction, and you end up with blue, eyes on one side or hazel and brown on the other. Green eyes exist in that thin, delicate overlap, which is exactly why they remain the rarest eye color humans have ever had. And exactly why, even with all of today's genetic tools, they're still the hardest color for science to reliably predict from raw DNA alone. What makes all of this genuinely remarkable is how recently the full explanation came together. For most of the 20th century, scientists were working off little more than pedigree charts and educated guesses, and the real molecular story didn't start falling into place until genome sequencing became affordable and widespread enough to compare thousands of individuals at once. It took researchers piecing together ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains, modern population genetics comparing living people across continents, and detailed biochemical studies of how melanin actually behaves inside iris tissue, all converging on the same key conclusion from completely different directions. That kind of convergence is usually a strong sign that scientists have actually found the real mechanism, rather than just another plausible-sounding theory waiting to be overturned by the next study. There are still open questions, particularly around exactly why the original mutation spread as successfully as it did, and researchers are continuing to refine the timeline using newly recovered ancient genomes from sites across Europe and Central Asia. But the core mechanism, the dimmer switch inside HER2, the fine-tuning from genes like TYR and SLC24A4, and the delicate melanin balance required to land on green specifically, is about as solid as modern genetics gets. So the next time you happen to look into a pair of green eyes, what you're actually looking at is a live demonstration of an ancient genetic accident, a mutation that first appeared in a single human being thousands of years ago near the mountains between Europe and Asia, refined further through generations of migration, and balanced today on one of the narrowest genetic tightropes in the entire human body. There's no green pigment involved anywhere in the process. It's melanin, physics, and an extraordinarily precise combination of genes, all working together to produce something that, against every statistical odd, still shows up in roughly 2 out of every 100 people walking the planet today.